Oh, there we go. So, hello. I never know how to start these things. I always start them with like 2 solid minutes of incoherent rambling. But you are
That sounds
listening.
about right.
Yeah, yeah, who would have guessed, right? So, you're listening to miserytourisms.com's Misery Movies podcast, which is a film podcast about movies. It's a movies podcast. Could you guess from the name? No, it's a podcast. It's a film discussion and critique podcast where we talk about miserable movies, movies about terrible situations, movies about sad, pathetic, disturbing things. And we're on episode number 11, which you would never have been able to guess from the sheer unprofessionalism of this intro. But so, as usual, I'm joined with a couple of our contributors, AJ,
Yo.
and for the first time on the podcast, Brandon.
Hello, hello. Happy to be here.
So, we are actually planning to do a series of Halloween themed podcasts because it's October and it's Halloween time. Now, in theory, we were hoping to do 3 or 4 basically Halloween themed movies, whether those be horror movies, ghost movies, just. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between the kind of dark, disturbing content that we normally do and Halloween anyway, but we're going to have even more Halloween themed films than usual. And our goal is to do 3 or 4 of those movies in rapid succession and record a podcast for each one and then post them up here. And hopefully we'll get all those podcasts up before the end of the month, before Halloween. We'll see. If you're listening to this around Christmas time and it was just posted yesterday, I apologize. But more importantly, AJ, whose only job is to put the intro and outro music on the podcast, I'm sure she apologizes sincerely too, right, AJ?
I have no regrets at
No
all.
regrets. No regrets about the episode you've been sitting on for like a
I'll
month.
probably be listening to Halloween podcasts around Christmas.
Yeah, that's true. You would enjoy that. It's Halloween all year round for you.
It is.
As it should be.
AJ, when does Halloween officially start?
Uh, August 25th.
Oh,
That is incorrect. It starts November 1st.
No, yeah, okay, all right. That's fair.
yeah, okay. So, yeah, that's fabulous. It's so basically Brandon's saying that your
All year Halloween.
2 month Halloween is too conservative, and
Oh, yeah. Amateur hour.
Okay.
12-month Halloween.
12-month Halloween. Okay, well, since we're now on the 12th month of 12-month Halloween, I think it's only appropriate that we do Halloween themed podcast. So, in that vein, our AJ.
No pun intended, right?
Oh Jesus! I already. Oh my God! How many unintentional puns am I? It's not good that we're 2-3 minutes into this podcast and I've already made one unintentional pun and I haven't said the name of the film yet. So the movie which AJ selected is What We Do in the Shadows. And AJ, since you picked the film, do you want to introduce it for us?
Sure. So, What We Do in the Shadows is a mockumentary comedy about vampires. And it follows a group of vampires in New Zealand who are staying in a flat together and their various hijinks.
They're the assorted vampire hijinks.
Exactly.
And yeah, this is definitely, as you said, a comedy. How would you describe this comedy, like, tonally? It's surprisingly, it's not really a particularly dark comedy, even though it's about
No, it
vampires.
really isn't.
But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a lighthearted comedy. But if you had to use a couple of adjectives to describe this comedy, AJ, two adjectives, what would they be?
I'd say it's fairly quirky.
Yeah, quirky was the first one on my mind too.
And
Yeah,
the
quirky fits.
second would be I'm drawing a blank, honestly.
Just quirky and quirky, right? Quirky and very quirky.
Yeah.
Maybe quirky and understated. Although not all of the humor is understated, but there's a lot of that. Like, it's actually it's a the film is made, as I think you mentioned, it's a New Zealand film, but there's a lot of that, like, office style, like,
I was going to say the same thing.
dry-ish British humor.
Right.
Yeah. It's offbeat. It's very offbeat. And yeah, comparing it to The Office is an excellent comparison.
It's
Yeah,
like The Office, but about vampires, basically.
The Office with vampires. Yes, go. I'm surprised they didn't put that on the poster. What we do in the shadows. The Office with vampires. So, with that in mind, one thing, we should go over the general structure of this podcast in case we have a new listener, and if someone's listening, they'd have to be a new listener. So the first half of this podcast, we're going to talk about this movie, What We Do in the Shadows, in sort of broad, general terms. The key thing is that we're going to be totally spoiler free for the first half of the podcast. So we'll talk about the movie maybe thematically, talk about the movie perhaps structurally, talk about, like, the plot only to the degree that it doesn't tell you anything that would ruin the movie for you. You know, we may talk about the launching off point of the plot, or the premise of the film, but it's going to be more kind of broad critique of the film. And that, at the end of that section, at the end of the first half, we're each going to review the film very quickly, give it a little rating, and then after that, I'll give you a warning. And the second half of the episode will have spoilers. And then we'll really dive in deep, and we'll talk about specific talk about specific scenes, and and the ending of the film, and things that you might not want to find out before watching the film for the first time. Particularly since it is a comedy, we're going to try not to give the punchlines to any jokes here in the first half either, because the worst thing in the world is to have a joke explained to you, especially before you've even heard the joke. So, with that in mind, AJ, do you have a launching off point for us here?
Maybe we could start by talking about the three main characters.
We could. I mean, they are. Yeah. I mean, do you want to kind of introduce us to the three main vampires, AJ?
Yes. So there is primarily a.
Hopefully, you remember their names because I didn't.
Let's see. There's first. I think it's Vladimir or some type of variation of Vlad something. It was just primarily
Vladislav.
Yeah, Vladislav. It's just primarily meant to, be Russian sounding, kind of.
Right. And certainly there are no other vampires we can think of named Vlad, right?
Exactly. So he is basically like a torturer and a ladies' man vampire.
Yeah. He's sort of a play on the archetypal medieval Vlad the Impaler Dracula vampire,
Very much so.
And And then there's Deacon, who is what type of archetype would you say that Deacon is?
Well, in the film, he's described as the bad boy, right? Because he's the younger vampire.
Yeah.
He's only 180 some years old, so he's the young, fresh-faced, would-be badass vampire.
Which to me is very, very ironic given the portrayal of him throughout the rest of the film.
Right.
But that's more that offbeat humor that they used.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And he's also the more, I guess, abrasive member of the group.
Yeah.
And then the third one, he's the Victorian dandy vampire, and I don't remember what's his name.
Viago, I think.
Viago, yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
He's a very fussy, sort of Oscar Wilde-esque vampire. So they really have all of their vampire bases covered here. There's also, in case you're worried they missed something, there is a Nosferatu-esque vampire called Peter, who lives in a coffin in the basement.
Yes.
And who is presumably the original vampire, at least in the group. So they really have, broadly speaking, every vampire archetype here.
Yeah, they did a good job of actually approaching kind of the wide breadth of material that's out there with the vampire concept.
That's one thing that is one thing that I definitely wanted to talk about with this film, is that for a comedy, this is surprisingly well versed in vampire folklore. There really isn't any little odds and endsy piece of vampire trivia that they don't shoehorn in here, which is great, because usually when you have a horror satire or a horror parody film, usually they don't go back much further than like the B movies, the like Hammer horror films, and they like, it's like Blackula, it's like, well, he looks like Dracula, but he's black, or it's like,
right.
It's some broad Dracula parody with the velvet cape and the typical sort of Bram Stoker getup there. Bram Stoker rather getup. And usually as a result, they don't really have that much to work with, and it usually ends up burning out of its material pretty quickly. Like, often the material is limited to, this guy can turn into a bat, and he's kind of a dandy, and he has a ridiculous accent, and then they play that for all it's worth. And this movie, on the other hand, really, and maybe you can say more about this, Brandon, since you're more of a vampire expert than I am, but it really seems to delve deep into vampire folklore. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a lot of
they did.
Small details that they mine for jokes that really...
Oh, definitely.
really, you wouldn't even... That actually, honest to goodness, serious face vampire films don't even get into,
Well, yeah,
so
it's way too easy. It's way too easy for anything that deals with vampires to be a very one-note kind of concept.
Right.
To produce a product that really just has that one focal point, and that's all that they do. They just drone on and on and on. But they really did do a great job of capturing the diversity of it. And I think some of it may have been inspired kind of by the White Wolf vampires, as far as some of the abilities that they portray throughout the film.
That's interesting. I didn't think about it, but maybe they are White Wolf players. I could see White Wolf players writing a movie like this.
Oh, absolutely. I also thoroughly appreciated the horrendous Eastern European accents coming out of New Zealand actors.
Yeah, that was pretty great.
I thought that was just pitch perfect.
Yeah. One thing, of course, maybe if they haven't played a lot of White Wolf, it's also possible that they're doing one better and drawing from the same source material, right? That
Oh, absolutely.
they've also done one thing you have to hand to role playing games is because they need to offer, as you said, a diversity of options in terms of races and classes and abilities and stuff. Often they'll dive pretty deep into their source material to find those options. So something like a White Wolf game, ironically, might be a little bit more well versed in vampire lore and especially in folklore and traditional conceptions of vampires
Oh, absolutely.
than a Dracula film because it has to do that extra legwork to offer those options. And I feel like the
Absolutely.
same thing might have been happening here, that they were like, we're gonna go, instead of like doing the like umpteenth horror parody film that makes fun of movies that were made in the in the fucking 30s and that have been parodied to death even by Saturday morning cartoons. Why don't we go back to the source material and find something there that we can make fun of? And I think the movie's better for it.
I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. You could definitely tell that they did their homework, and it paid off.
Yeah. AJ, did you want to jump in on this?
No, that's yeah. I also agree with that. Yep.
So one thing about, for those of you who maybe have listened to previous podcasts, which I assume none of you have, but just the hypothetical audience,
Bound to happen
one thing
eventually.
would know about AJ's films is that up to this point, she's had a tendency to pick very polarizing films. The first film you picked was Hard Candy, right? Which I thought was I thought it was idiotic. I thought it was one of the stupidest movies I've ever seen.
Uh,
And Sarah, who is not on this podcast, but who has been with us in the past, really loved it. And of course, you liked it since you picked it. And then your second film was another very quirky indie film called Black Pond. And I thought it was good. I thought it was a solid film, but Sarah fucking hated it. Absolutely despised that movie. Now that your turn has come now that your turn has come around again, I'm kind of curious to see if the AJ effect is going to continue, and if if this is going to be a film that one of us loves and the other hates, or if we're going to have broad agreement about it. We'll see.
Honestly, I'm kind of disappointed with my own movie choice this time, especially since it's like the Halloween edition,
Mm-hmm.
so it should be my time to shine. But I couldn't really find any other. I really wanted to find a found footage style movie that Will would absolutely hate, because that is that's kind of like a formula for Will to hate something and me to like it.
oh, I would have hated that too.
That would have been a great podcast, but this one I feel is going to be mainly like just a bunch of yes men.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, I will say that I've never seen a found footage horror movie that I liked. So odds would have been good that I would have hated it. Not that I've seen many. I mean, it's not a genre I'm really particularly interested in at all. I mean, I don't really like horror films very much to begin with, and if you add like the found footage conceit on top of that, I don't know.
I'm very deeply into found footage, but like a lot of the movies that I've found just don't satisfy that like indie aesthetic itch.
I'm going to be honest. I don't think I've ever seen a great found footage film. I don't want to get too far away from this movie, but I don't think I've seen some that I've sort of liked. Like Chronicle was fine, although it eventually reached a point where it was really stretching the limits of found footage. To the degree that like they had to integrate like cell phone cameras and stuff in order to have a source of the footage. And I thought that was kind of cool, but but it wasn't a great film by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, while you're talking about while this isn't a found footage film, this is a mockumentary, as you said, which isn't that far from being a found footage film.
Right. I also
Which,
like documentaries very much.
well, I was going to say you must like mockumentaries because Black Pond was also a sort of, it wasn't a mockumentary because it wasn't really a satirical film, but it was sort of a faux documentary, or it had documentary elements.
Right, yeah.
And since you mentioned that, we might as well talk about this movie as a mockumentary. Um, how effective do you guys think it was as a mockumentary?
I think it worked, um, but the concept of it being a mockumentary in the film didn't quite fit. It was.
Oh, why do you say
kind
that?
of
I mean,
it's a
that's
weird
interesting. Why
balance
do you-
point for me because as a film itself, being a mockumentary and having that mockumentary format presentation, I like it.
Mhm.
But it never really quite grounded for me as far as why they had a film crew following them around in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean that's a running joke that they reference at multiple times
Yeah.
through the film, and I think
Right,
that's
yeah.
a sort of your mileage may vary thing. Like, is that a funny joke or is that just preposterous? You know, is it?
Right.
And I think that depending on who you are and your sense of humor, the very fact that the documentary crew is there at all is gonna I don't know. It's either going to be hilarious or you're going to be spending the whole movie like shaking your fists at that conceit.
Yeah. It's the question of suspension of disbelief
Right.
and just
I
ignoring the fact that a fourth wall is even supposed to be there.
I think it landed for me, and the precise way that they intended it to land. I think of it was wonderful for several reasons. One, because I just love the mockumentary like format in a movie. It just makes a movie like really enjoyable to watch. Because you have the cutscenes of like the characters, and that's split with what's actually happening. But then of course there's like the joke of there's the documentary crew following them around, but they also never address it, which I really appreciate because like in so many movies
They do address it though. I mean,
well, they don't
Yeah,
like
they do.
address it further than like they
oh, I see what
address
you're
it
saying. I see what you're saying. They acknowledge it, but
Yeah.
they don't address why the heck that's happening.
Yeah.
Exactly. They don't address it, but they acknowledge it. But in so many similar movies, like you'll find horror movies that want to use a found footage kind of mechanic, and they'll make up like the most absurd premise to explain it. They'll jump through so many hoops of like I was reading about a horror film the other day where the main premise, the main thing that you're supposed to be scared of is that several different people are sent cameras, and like they get an anonymous threat that if they stop filming, they'll die.
Oh God! So it's like found footage speed, basically. It's speed,
Right.
except instead of the bus slowing down, it's if you turn the camera off.
Right, and they're like clamoring so hard to get an excuse of why there's people filming there, and What We Do in the Shadows never addressed that fully, and I appreciate that because it's kind of a sort of remark on those films as well.
Right. And I think the reality is if that we were living in a universe where vampires were real, this would totally have happened. I mean, people will make a documentary about literally anything, and they don't need much of an excuse to do it. And particularly if the vampires were, there's a lot of in this film, and this kind of maybe even goes back to White Wolf 2, B-Boy and the Masquerade, but it's very important to the vampires that they keep their secrecy and keep their privacy and don't get outed, basically.
Yeah,
So in a
absolutely.
society, in a world where vampires are real and they're highly secretive, I mean, that would be a major get for a documentarian. Like, to
But
the
they're-
point where you would take the kind of ridiculous risks that they do take in filming this.
But they're also like not secretive enough so that any documentary crew would be able to find out about them.
Right, right, and that in and of itself is a sort of running joke throughout the film, where people will be like, "Well, you know, we need. It's really important that you not like break our circle of privacy or a circle of trust." So they're like, "There's a fucking film crew right there," you know. And that I thought that that joke worked for me, and I as a documentary, one thing that I didn't like or totally buy about Black Pond is how poorly or incompletely integrated the pseudo documentary parts were to the rest of the film. That was one of my gripes about the film, was that it was this weird mix of, there were some like office style like recorded documentary interviews with the characters, right, where they were like clearly being interviewed by someone and they were giving those kind of responses. And the rest of the film was purely dramatic in the way it was structured. A bunch of scenes with these characters interacting, but the way it was structured, it wasn't like those scenes were supposed to be reenactments. It wasn't like the documentary crew was supposed to be present during those scenes. So the entire like documentary thing was just a framing device, and it was a very loose and kind of awkward framing device. Whereas in this film, I think the mockumentary format is used really well. It's used really well from a comedic standpoint, in that they wring just about every joke they possibly can out of the presence of the camera crew.
Oh, I would agree with that.
And
I would definitely agree with that.
It's also just well integrated in terms of the structure of the film. It's actually structured very much like a documentary, where they give you kind of a teaser about where it's going in the beginning, and then it does end up in that place. And it's shot very much like a documentary too. It never, like, the camera is often a little behind the action, like something starts to happen and the camera moves, like, oh shit, something's going on, which is like a major no-no in dramatic film, where the camera is supposed to be ahead of what's going on, right? But which is a necessity of documentaries, where the cameraman is in theory responding to real events.
And I think that helped a lot with the lower budget that this film had too, because it let them kind of skirt around some of those big budget moments and still have them happen somehow.
Exactly. I think that's a great point, B-Boy. I totally agree with you on that, because it really does. One of the great fundamental problems of horror films, and I'm not going to be the first. Like, no one's going to be hearing this from me for the first time, but is the fundamental fact that, like, the monsters always look cheesy given enough light and exposure, right? Even the best CGI in the world, even the most sophisticated computer graphics, it still usually fails at making something look legitimately terrifying. And often they end up looking cheesy or quirky or just weird and funny.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of horror films get around this problem. Well, the stupider horror films, the worst horror films, don't even try to get around that problem. They're just like, I've got $50 and I've got some computer graphics rendering software I've got DAZ 3D on my computer, and we're going to make this work, and we're going to show it in its full glory. But slightly more sophisticated.
Well, I mean, my God, there's a 6-movie series titled The Ginger Dead Man. There's at least 6 or 7 evil Bong movies out there right now. I mean, some of these horror films they don't even try anymore.
Right. They're like a mix between horror and parody, but they succeed at neither.
Exactly.
They're not scary and they're not funny, really, except in the like maybe
Exactly.
you've taken a few hits from that Bong that you just maybe then it
Well, I
becomes
mean,
funny, and then you start to crave the
my
Ginger
God,
Dead Man. But
the Ginger Dead Man is voiced by Gary Busey. You're gonna have a scarier horror film just putting Gary Busey on the screen for 2 hours.
yeah. Yeah. CV boy, this is why, and I do want to come back to this, but this is why I wanted you on this episode, because I don't watch horror films. AJ watches like 3-minute, YouTube videos that are supposed to be scary, But at least you watch actual horror films, so you've got a frame of reference.
Oh
here
yeah,
that I don't have.
I love them.
AJ
I love them,
watches,
and yet I hate them at the same time because they never seem to deliver what I want them to deliver.
Right. Right, exactly, and that's the failing of most horror films. I just want to go back. I just want to make fun of AJ some
God
more.
damn it.
Like if you know what, if you were to say to AJ like what's a horror film, the first thing she's going to imagine is like 3 minutes of a 90s television midnight test pattern that at the end of it it grows increasingly pixelated over and staticky over the course of the 3-minute running time, and at the end of it, someone screams.
No.
Oh.
God damn it. My idea of a horror film is like 17 seconds of some animated alien thing with weird long legs crawling on a building, okay?
Right. That's presented as truth. So anyway, I mean, I'm not knocking that. Honestly, that's a lot more effective, and it's a lot easier for horror to be effective in smaller doses.
And it's kind of a sad statement to the state of the genre that these jump scare YouTube videos are better at delivering an actual moment of terror than big budget, big studio backed productions.
Right. Exactly. And certainly also at conveying not just like that fear, but also
Right.
that general sense of like unease.
Exactly.
And that like percolating sense of horror that is almost totally absent from horror films today, and that you really need to go back to like Hitchcock and a lot of, and B-Boy is going to cringe when I say this, but older Japanese horror films in order to recapture.
No, I actually enjoy some of the older Japanese horror films. It's more the modern ones that wind up remade by American studios like The Grudge and The Ring, where it's just, all right, we're just going to paint this child a ghostly white, give them stringy black hair, dump a bucket of water on them, and have them go do something creepy off in the background.
Yeah,
I
hate
it's just such
The Ring. I saw The Ring for the first time when I was in high school, and I think it was just kind of pivotal moment for me as someone who like appreciates or doesn't appreciate films. Like I think that was the moment when some switch went off in my head, and I realized exactly what it got my first real inkling of what it was that made a film good or bad, because there's so much superficially in The Ring that is cool, and that like if you're a person it would be very easy as like someone who just enjoyed shit movies to enjoy The Ring, because it's a good looking film. Those like the film within, now I'm reviewing The Ring, but the like video within the film that they watch that like summons the ghost child is actually pretty well put together. I think AJ would appreciate it as like an aesthetic montage of scary looking images.
Yeah.
But the movie itself is dog shit of the highest caliber. It's plotted in a
absolutely.
really idiotic way. The concept is stupid. None of the characters act like rational human beings. The dialogue is atrocious. Everything that makes a film a good film is missing, and everything that assembly line filmmakers think makes a good horror film is present in excess.
Well, and that's kind of the plague of the genre right now. Is it's all style and no substance.
Right.
They have all the flash and all the visuals. They've got all of that lined up the way they want it, but they can't actually deliver something solid behind that.
Right, absolutely.
And
So-
to get back to what we do in the shadows, they actually deliver on what they were trying to do with their style.
Right.
And I think that was what I enjoyed most about the movie.
Right. And I think what I want to do is, since we've been talking about horror films, let's talk about the movie as a horror movie, and then let's talk about it as a comedy. I know it is a comedy first and
I think that's a good idea.
First and foremost, I mean, it's certainly more a comedy than a horror film, but since it is dealing with vampires, and since it's kind of adjacent to the horror genre, and since we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about other horror films, I feel like we should pay that off in some way. So, how did you feel about
Oh, I
this
agree.
as a horror film?
I think it was actually more effective than a lot of movies have been lately. They had the
You think
gore.
this was a scary movie?
The gore effects were terrible, but they had them.
Right.
Would I call it a scary movie? No.
Oh.
But at the same time, there are elements that certainly would have applied in a scary movie. Obviously, we can't go into details at this stage,
Right.
but there were flashes where you could see definite indications that these vampires are no joke, even in a film that's really just one big, long-running joke.
Right. Yeah, AJ.
I think that it had a really effective undertone. It wasn't intended to be a horror movie, and I think like it didn't unintentionally become a horror movie, but
Right.
it was part of, they wanted to make it like, they wanted to remind you that these are, vampires, and they're actually killing people.
Right.
And
Right.
they were good at like keeping that reminder through the film, which I appreciated like vastly. So I think that it wasn't like a horror movie, but it was like like Brandon said, it was serious in a way underneath all of the comedy.
Yeah, I think it doesn't shy away from the reality of the reality. I mean, nobody is actually a vampire, but it doesn't share away from what the reality of being a vampire would be, if that makes any sense. Like it's not afraid, for the most part, of exploring the darker side of its own concept. It doesn't, a lot of superficially, a lot of horror parodies don't really, like, they either go one way or another, with like to one extreme or the other. Like they go whole hog on the gore and that becomes the one joke that becomes it becomes a huge part of the jokes, right? Or they like totally neuter the monster, to the point where it's like just goofy, just silly, and that's what you're supposed to laugh at, how silly this vampire is, or at how silly this Frankenstein knockoff is, or whatever. This movie, um, to its benefit, doesn't isn't afraid of either of those extremes and doesn't totally commit itself to either of those extremes. Like it makes no effort to avoid the sillier, stupider parts of vampire mythology, but it also doesn't feel the need to yuck it up to an extreme degree. And it also doesn't really totally throw itself like into the blood and gore thing to absolute excess, but it's also certainly not afraid of that. And it's certainly not afraid of the fact that these vampires, as AJ says, they're killing people. They're murdering human beings.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really try to make excuses for their behavior either. But it also doesn't really condemn their behavior, which is an interesting place to be.
It's a very unapologetic take on the concept.
Right. It's very
they weren't afraid to show that.
Yeah, sorry.
They weren't afraid to show that these vampires are, by their very nature, violent creatures. And at the same time, they have one of the most bizarre casts possible for such violent creatures.
Yeah.
Because these characters, especially Viago, you would never see violence in that character.
No.
Just to look at the character himself and the whole concept of the Victorian dandy.
Right? Yeah.
To have a character like that, and then to have that reminder that, oh shit, this is a vampire. It has to kill people in order to stay not alive, but in order to continue existing. I think that was actually a very, very effective aspect of it.
Right. And one thing I liked, and this is getting a little bit away from the film as a horror film, is that when you get to those moments where they're trying to feed and they're trying to figure out how to feed, those moments could have been like played up for horror. They could have been scary, or they could have been made like goofy, like oh, he flies in through the window and he hits his head on a beam and then he says something in his goofy Romanian accent, which is how it usually works, right? When they're doing a horror parody, it's like, or he can't get out of bat form or something and he's oops. But what's wonderful about this film though is that those scenes aren't scary and they're not really silly. They're just profoundly awkward.
Yeah.
and that profound awkwardness is just so much funnier than if it was played for yucks.
Yeah, I really appreciated how mundane they made all these moments with these fantastical beings as vampires. They made them seem like, well, this is life. This is how it is. And
but
I think that was
in a very awkward way as well.
Yeah.
Where you're like, you feel it during the scene, and it makes it absolutely hilarious.
Right, it's Schadenfreude, right? You would cringe, but you laugh instead.
Yeah, and I liked how even during some of these awkward moments, they would pan the camera to the other characters that are present and not directly involved in the awkwardness, and have them just standing there awkwardly reacting to what the hell is going on in front of them, like, oh, here we go. He got us into another fucking mess this time.
Right. Which is another great mockumentary technique,
Oh, absolutely.
One thing about the movie as a horror film, I agree it's not a scary movie. There's one sequence in the movie, and I'm not going to spoil it. Maybe we can talk about it in the spoiler inclusive part of the podcast. But there is one sequence in the movie that almost gets scary. But it also doesn't cease to be hilarious, and it's this wonderful. I almost wish there were more sequences like that one in the movie, because it's this wonderful like tightrope act where you're like 1 minute you're like, and the next minute you're like, oh my god, and it's this real like up and down, back and forth between like cringing and laughing and being a little bit worried and scared, and then yeah, but aside from that, there aren't really many scary moments in the film, including later in the film. But
And I would also like to touch on it because it is in the description of the movie itself that there are werewolves.
There are werewolves
in this movie universe as well. And I actually have to touch on this because for me, werewolves are one of my favorite movie monsters. And that's another one of those Schadenfreude moments for me because there are so few decent, watchable werewolf movies out there.
Right.
Almost all of them are just absolute dog shit.
Right.
And a lot of that comes down to the actual monster suits that are used for the werewolves. I was actually impressed with what they were able to do with the werewolf suits in this movie on a budget that was probably cobbled together from the shoestrings of everybody that played a speaking part in the film.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The visual effects in this movie are not bad. Like we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of clever evasions in place. In this case, they don't. I think I kind of got sidetracked from that. But what they do most of the time is they show, it's like they'll shoot things in the dark and they only reveal a certain amount of the monster, and that builds up suspense and that builds up fear.
Mm-hmm.
In this film, they use the documentary structure of the film to be able to show things kind of fuzzy, grainy, out of focus. The camera gets there later. We're not really looking at this thing because the cameraman's not really looking at it. But when you do get glimpses of the monsters, whether it's the werewolves as werewolves or the vampires in bat form or another particularly hilarious visual effect that I'm not going to mention because
I think I know exactly what you're talking about.
Because it would be a spoiler and it would ruin a joke. It works. I mean, you don't think, oh, that's cheesy CGI. You buy it to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, in a lot of ways, the horror and the scary, not necessarily scary, but the horror elements of the film reminded me a lot of watching The Evil Dead for the first time when I was younger, which any horror film buff is going to know The Evil Dead right off the bat. But, Bruce Campbell movies that were one of the first films made by Sam Raimi, they made them fresh. They made the first film fresh out of college on a $20,000 budget back in the early 80s. And it stood the test of time and became this huge cult classic. Very much a horror comedy that did manage to go way over the top with the gore, but they stayed over the top with the comedy as well, and they balanced the two very nicely.
Yeah.
And for me, this film did a lot of the same things, but it was a much more subdued way of doing it.
Yeah, much more understated. It's definitely, yeah, I would agree with that. So, and that's a good segue into this movie as a comedy, which is obviously what it's aiming to be and what it, I think, succeeds handily at.
Absolutely.
I think my favorite thing about this movie is that it's not afraid to show and to really dig into just how lame vampires actually are. Like, once again, there tends to be this dichotomy in horror films and in vampire films between, your straight-faced, dramatic horror films. And they really want vampires. They are obsessed with the idea that vampires are cool as shit. Like, they think vampires are just the raddest fucking thing on planet Earth, and you can tell. And whether they play that up in the Twilight style by making them like cute boys, and cute immortal boys who shimmer or whatever the fuck it is, or whether they play it up in the style of like Blade, where he's a half vampire ninja. He's got big guns and he has a sword and he cuts up vampires with swords and he wears a cool leather jacket and all of that. And every vampire he fights is like this quasi Nosferatu looking motherfucker who with like fangs and like wearing a biker jacket. And It's like, wow, and you're supposed to, if you're fucking 16 years old, you're like, that's fucking rad. That's amazing. Holy shit, Blade is so cool, and all the vampires are so cool. Or even if it's a more traditional kind of Dracula take, the idea is, well, let's make the vampire as sophisticated as possible. This is a suave kind of ladies' man vampire, and he's the coolest guy in the room, and he's also really dangerous. And then the other extreme, as I said, if you're doing a horror parody film, the vampire is just going to be silly and goofy or whatever. But and the idea is, he's like, it's like silly. But they've never before have I seen a film go so completely deep in the idea that vampires aren't really particularly silly. They're just lame and antiquated and out of touch with society. And if you met a vampire on the street, you met a dude who's fucking 600 years old, he's not going to know how to dress. I mean, like, think of your own grandparents, right? Who maybe are 80 years old. And just like, have you ever had to show an old person how to use like a computer?
Well, let's see. I work in retail,
Yeah.
and we have photo kiosks, and on a daily basis, I get to witness that exact same thing.
And the only people who use photo kiosks are old people.
Because all the normal people usually just send things online to the store to have it printed.
Right.
If people even print
or
pictures
they have
anymore.
a photo printer, or they just keep a digital copy of it in their digital photo album and on their phone and on Google Photos.
Exactly.
In the cloud, But you reach a point where your opinions don't change very much, your sense of style doesn't change very much, your willingness to adapt to a changing world atrophies, and you become lame.
Yeah, absolutely.
And vampires, on top of that, like, lameness that comes from them being so old and out of touch, is just a natural lameness that comes with vampirehood and all of our expectations about vampires. Like, if you think about vampire fashion, which is something this movie riffs on to no end. If you really think about it,
and in just absolute beautiful fashion, no less. they really hit some high notes with that in this film.
Yeah, that was.
And I think we'll talk about that more in the second half, so we can be more specific about it, because there's some real standouts there.
Right, and I'm sure we will. But if you think about it, absent like a costume designer, if you have the generally the same sense of like, style as vampires do, you're gonna look pretty stupid. You're gonna look like with these ruffled shirts and the weird, like, and it's just, so. And the movie really.
Well, I think that's something that usually.
Yeah.
Really kind of gets dismissed too, because, like you said, most films focus on trying to portray vampires as being just, the coolest dude in the room.
Right.
And thematically, the way they usually do that is, we'll just take this time period, that's when he's from, and then they look at the absolute best of, as far as the style goes for that era. Like, if they're talking medieval Europe, they're going to put the guy in, leather boots, leggings, and a loose, billowy shirt. And it looks cool. There's a certain flow to that.
Right. It looks cool for a couple of reasons. One, as you said, because of this is professional costume design, and also all of the other characters in the universe are dressed the same way, just worse. But also because of the casting, right? Because the vampire is always, the person cast to play the vampire is always some really sophisticated guy, or he's either some pretty boy, or he's a really kind
Right.
of Michael Fassbender, sort of muscular, imposing presence.
Yeah.
Where he's got
Yeah.
that kind of Al Pacino in his prime, sort of natural, like, authority and charisma to him. They don't usually cast people like these guys. And when you see
Oh
these
yeah.
guys
No.
dressed that way, the whole thing occupies this just wonderful space between their perception of how cool they are, because they're fucking vampires. I must be right. Like, at one
Yeah.
point
Absolutely.
that's stated outright. Like, we're sexy, we're vampires. Between that
Yeah.
perception and the reality of just how silly and lame they look, like, this movie thrives in this vacuum between those two spaces, between those 2 points.
It does. It does. And I think it kind of raises a good point in a way too, without directly raising it, that if you think about, I'm actually going to go into this from a if vampires were real standpoint. If you really
That's why
think
you're here,
about it,
B-boy.
yeah, if you really think about it, you look throughout history,
Yeah.
and vampires are always portrayed as, oh, well, they were nobility before they were turned. They were these high-ranking people in society. No, motherfucker, they had guards. They
Yeah,
had
right.
people
Who can the
watching out
vampire
for
get
them.
to? Yeah.
Vampires aren't just going to waltz into a castle and bite the king. That's not how this is going to happen. The vampires are going to pick off the dregs of society. They're going to pick off the people that are drunk in an alleyway somewhere, and they're going to say, you know what? There's something wrong with you. We're going to take you.
Right.
Vampires are predators. They don't
Right.
go after the healthy. They don't go after the strong unless they're desperate. They're going to go after the weak. They're going to go after the vulnerable. They're going to go after the targets.
And I think this film does a good job of portraying that. And I think you really hit
absolutely.
the nail on the head with Predator. I mean, these vampires come across as this weird mix between, like, like Woody Allen-esque neurotics and predatory animals. And I think it really finds a great sweet spot there between acknowledging the fact that their whole lifestyle is sort of inherently animalistic, inherently, like, tied to the and this is true of the werewolves as well, but inherently tied to the patterns, and in part because that's sort of where the folklore gets inspiration from, but tied to the patterns of nocturnal predators. But on the other hand, they're also these sort of sad sack people trying to survive with intelligence, with personalities, trying to survive to some degree both in human society and cloistered away from human society, and all of that stuff. Like, the movie keeps all of those balls in the air in a remarkably impressive way. I mean, there's a surprisingly large amount going on here, considering that it is fundamentally a sort of goofy horror mockumentary.
Yeah, and I liked the fact that early on in the film they kind of touch on how many vampires there are in this city. And
right. And it's a surprisingly large amount considering how small the city is.
Yeah, well, it's another one of those points where that kind of made me think, okay, there's some White Wolf influence going on here, because White Wolf always kind of estimated what a population can support as far as having vampires in them. That was one of the things that they always featured in their little city building discussions was, all right, so
like an ecosystem.
100,000 people. Yeah, it's an ecosystem, exactly.
If you have assuming the vampires are like the apex predator in that ecosystem,
right?
You can only support so many of them.
Exactly. And I thought that they did a really good job of doing that, especially with some of the oddballs that they just kind of come across as they're walking down the streets.
Yeah.
And kind of pointing out, like, okay, hey, I know this one, I know this one.
Right.
I thought that was a nice little touch.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was one of the better moments in the movie. AJ, do you want to talk about the movie as a comedy at all?
I would agree with all the previously made points.
Wow. Thanks. Thank you, AJ.
Also, we should probably get on to the second half.
Okay.
Here all night.
Well, we need to do our reviews of the film first, so we can do that.
Yes.
So does anyone else have anything they want to talk about broadly? Any thematically or whatever?
I think I'm pretty good on that.
Good. Okay. AJ.
I'm good.
Okay. So AJ, you picked the film. Why don't you give your review first?
Okay, I would like to say that this movie is extremely enjoyable to watch. Um, it's not irritating. It's not particularly it's not particularly profound. It's definitely not extremely scary, but it's a wonderful way to spend an hour and a half, and you'll probably enjoy it. So you should definitely watch it.
And your
And
score?
my score, I would give it probably 9 out of 10 vultures.
Okay. B-boy?
Well, I definitely I appreciated a lot of what they did in the movie. I think they used the tools that they had to their fullest. It's not a particularly fast-paced movie, so if you're someone that's looking to just have a movie suck you right in,
Mhm.
this probably isn't it. This is one that you really got to kind of focus to really settle in and watch. But I would probably give it at least, I'll say 7 vultures out of 10.
7 out of 10. You betrayed me. You're going with AJ's 10 vulture system. It's supposed to be a 5 vulture system.
Brandon's on my side.
No. But yeah, I really want to say I fucking hated this movie. Just so that we can keep the tradition going with someone hating AJ's movies. But I think you can tell from what I said before that I actually really enjoyed this movie. One thing that I don't think we stressed enough is this is a really fucking funny film. Like
It is.
all alliteration aside. Oh, God damn it! This is motherfucker.
You're on a roll tonight.
This is a this is a hilarious movie. It really is. I mean, the vast majority of the jokes land. A lot of them will make you laugh out loud, and the jokes that might not land are all pretty innocuous and not obnoxious, which I think is AJ said too. Like some comedies, the jokes that don't land, you're like, oh god, it's uncomfortable, But this movie, it's very kind of genial film. It's very easy to like this movie, very easy to enjoy this movie, and when it gets on a roll, it really works. It is very funny. The jokes. This is a movie I would definitely watch again. And I'm not a big comedy person, and I'm not someone who will watch a comedy twice usually, but I would definitely watch this one twice because I know there are jokes I missed.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there were things going on in the background. I know there were things going on sort of out of frame. I know there were lines that had implications, kind of that Arrested Development syndrome where you're not getting all of it. And you want to go back and watch it again and see which jokes you missed. And that's the kind of comedy I really love, is that sort of layered comedy. So I definitely really enjoyed it. I think that this is probably, not that there's that much competition outside of like the original Nosferatu, but this is probably the best vampire movie I've seen. This is probably the best horror comedy that I've seen. Once again, not much competition there.
AJ's good at picking movies.
Yeah, well, you can talk once you're right now. You're 1 and 3, so you can talk when. when you get your record up there. I believe I'm 3 for 3, AJ. Nobody has given any film that I've picked an even mildly negative review. So just putting that out there, not to brag, but you started bragging first, so I'm gonna. Anyway, this is a. Well, Brandon, you wait until you pick movies, okay? Well, I mean, honestly, there's also an argument to be made for picking films that you don't even necessarily like very much that you think would stir an interesting conversation, which I think is what Sarah does, because Sarah has, in some cases, not liked the films that she picked. Been pretty brutal even to the films that she picked, but there's always been an interesting conversation. Anyway, back to What We Do in the Shadows. This is just like, as a vampire movie, I really appreciated the just dedication to the source material. It's a lot smarter than you would think this movie was going to be if you just read a synopsis of it and it was like this vampire mockumentary. Like, okay, this quirky vampire mockumentary. It actually is way smarter, and it digs a lot deeper. And it's not a deep movie, particularly compared to some of the other movies we've reviewed on this podcast. But it also doesn't, for the most part, really shy away from the philosophical implications of eternal life or the moral implications of having to feed on other intelligent creatures to survive. It's not afraid of those things, and it also doesn't moralize either, which is great. It's not shaking its fist at the vampires, but it's also not afraid to really confront the implications of their lifestyle. So all of that considered, I would give this 4 out of 5 vultures. Okay, so that's it for the reviews. After this point, if you're still listening and you have not seen the movie, my recommendation is you pause this podcast and you go watch the movie. If you're an Amazon Prime subscriber, this is actually free with Amazon Video, so you could just open it up in another browser window right now and watch it and come back to the podcast. If you're not
highly recommend doing that.
Yeah, and if you don't like if you listen to our reviews and you don't think you're going to be interested in the film, and for some reason you're interested in hearing us talk about it for another half an hour or so, you can just stick around. If you don't mind spoilers, even in a comedy, if you don't mind having your jokes ruined for you in advance, you can stick around too. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into the film here. How do we want to broach this?
Favorite scenes, maybe?
I'm sorry, AJ, what was that?
We could go over favorite scenes.
Sure. Why don't you get us started?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, one of my favorite scenes is when, actually, first we should talk about Stu, I think.
Oh yeah, we didn't mention Stu at all. Well, what do you want to talk about, Stu?
Well, mentioning Stu would have led into spoilers of other parts of the story.
Yeah,
that we kind of agreed we weren't going to go over because he's kind of a later act character.
Right, and we didn't talk about Nick even obliquely in the introduction.
Yeah.
But
when you got to talk about Nick, you're going to talk about Stu.
Right. So if you haven't seen the movie and you're just listening to give you some orientation here, Nick is an individual who is converted to vampirism about a quarter of the way into the movie. Basically, he's a would-be victim who ends up being turned into a vampire by Peter, who's the original vampire, the Nosferatu vampire, instead of ending up as a meal for the other vampires. And he has this kind of awkward transition into vampirism. Vampirism? I don't know. Vampiricism?
The first two both work. The third one, not so much.
I want to do a vampirical analysis of this film. Um,
Oh,
but he becomes a vampire over the course of the film, and so he's
in
part
a
of the film is him
fantastic chase scene, might I add.
in a
Just a
fantastic.
fantastic chase scene.
Yes,
led up
and I
to
do
his
want to
being
talk about
turned.
that scene in detail later after we talk about
Yeah, yeah.
Stu. But so anyway, and he's a big chunk of the film is about his kind of awkward transition into becoming a full-fledged vampire, and he has this friend Stu, who is his human friend who he doesn't really want to give up when he becomes a vampire. So he brings Stu in. I'm gonna keep calling him Snoo for some reason. He brings Stu into the flat and introduces him to all his vampire friends. And then after that, Stu is just kind of there.
Well, because Stu is a great guy.
He's a great guy, yeah. Apparently,
I mean, he's useful. He's got skills.
right.
Yep.
Stu is everything Napoleon Dynamite wishes he could have been.
And Stu, it's
I
kind
don't
of
know
funny.
why I'm comparing a movie that I enjoyed to a movie I couldn't stand, but
Yeah, I found
there
that
it
movie incredibly abrasive. That is one of I just never understood.
yeah,
Anyway, it's it's kind of funny because Stu becomes. You would think that Nick would be the one who, if this was following a kind of conventional structure, like the vampires would teach Nick how to be a vampire, and Nick would teach the vampires like how to survive in the modern world. He'd be the one that brings them out of their shell and gets them to, adapt to the modern world, pick up modern technology, and so on and so forth. But instead, it's Stu who becomes the one who shows them how to use Skype, who shows them how to use Facebook, who shows them how to use eBay, which leads to the one joke in the movie that I groaned at, and the dark knitting.
I knew that when I saw that scene. I was like, oh, Will is not gonna like this.
But yeah, AJ, what did you want to say about Stu?
Well, basically, one of my favorite scenes kind of stems from Stu teaching the vampires about technology, and he's teaching Viago, like he's getting Viago set up on Skype, and Viago has like a former servant that he's reconnecting with on Skype, and they go on a video call, and his servant is very old and ecstatic to see him
He's
again.
90.
Yeah, he's 90. And he tells Viago, he's like, I did nothing with my life. I was waiting for you. I'm so glad to hear from you. I'm so excited that, you're
finally going to make me a vampire.
You're going to make me a vampire. and Viago's like, oh, it was nice to see you. And then he like hangs up and closes the laptop. And he like looks at the camera. He's like, ugh,
Yeah, that was a great scene.
And that was awesome because like it was just like the delivery of like it was hilarious, but it was also like tinged with that complete uneasiness, and it was also completely awkward, and it was it was a very good scene.
Yeah, it was sort of the quintessential awkward scene, the quintessential sort of awkward humor that runs through the movie. And one thing I liked about that scene was it was another instance where it's like the movie really digs into the impact that these vampires' selfish choices are having on the humans around them. Mm-hmm. And that moment, perhaps more than any, you see this guy he's devoted his whole life, like completely, to the idea that he's going to serve this guy, and if he serves him, he'll get to be a vampire someday. And the vampire has totally forgotten about him, pretty much. I mean, He just totally moved on. And then the thought of like going back there and like having to sort that problem out, he's like, nah, fuck it. I'm not even gonna. Oops.
Well, I mean,
nice
in
to see you.
Viago's defense,
Yeah.
His servant did pay the wrong postage,
That's true.
so
And that did kind of fuck him in the long run. Well, not in the
Fantastic.
long run, but in the short run
No.
anyway.
yeah.
It did
And
kind
I
of.
thought that was another one of those fantastic little details where they mentioned that the wrong postage was paid in shipping his coffin
shipping his coffin.
to
Yeah.
New Zealand.
Right.
It could have just been such a throwaway joke. They could have just left it there, but they managed to bring it up in that moment, and it was just perfect.
Right. And that
It was one of those great little Chekhov's gun moments.
Right. And not only that, but it's also a pretty clear reference to Nosferatu. Where there's a whole there's a whole sequence that involves Nosferatu being shipped from wherever his origin point is, whether it's I want to say it's Romania, but I don't remember the movie very well. But there's a whole sequence that takes place on the ship that's about transferring his coffin to England, I believe, and that of course is not played for humor in Nosferatu, and also the question of like there's this whole thing about vampires and bodies of water and like and what they can and can't do. So
Yeah.
so it was a pretty clear reference. It was just another little detail that ties into both the film history of vampires and also into vampire folklore. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, they had some really nice hidden gems as far as making those references. One of my favorite scenes, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the costuming, was that scene very early on where the three main vampires are getting ready to go out and they're trying to figure out what to wear, and they're drawing sketches of each other.
Yes, because they can't see each other in the mirror.
Because they can't see their own reflections.
And the sketches are so bad.
Oh, they're just terrible. And then when Stu shows up, and then when Stu arrives and Nick arrives, and they see cell phones and cameras, and they realize, wait a second, we could have been taking pictures this whole time.
Right. Now, I'm hearing a little bit of an echo right now.
I was also hearing that.
Yeah.
People, were you? I think it's okay.
I've been noticing that too.
Oh, huh. I wonder where it's. It just started for me. Did anyone have any kind of any change in their audio settings or anything?
No.
Huh. Well, it seems to have settled down now, so whatever. What was I going? So the one thing that I really like about Stu, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Viago's servant, is he's the perfect encapsulation of that, like the running toll that they're having on the lives of human beings around them. It's really great that they brought a real, honest-to-goodness human into this thing and had them get attached to him, even if kind of as a pet, because then we start to see, like, now you have a human in this situation that is just inherently dangerous for him, and they're all so nonchalant about it. It's funny because you as an audience member realize that like Stu is in like serious mortal danger every second of this film, but they're like, hey, it's Stu, we decided not to eat him. Which leads to that really like great sequence when he's at the ball, and they've gotten just so used to Stu being around. It's like, hey, it's Stu. And then they realize, oh shit, there's all these other vampires here and other undead and other like supernatural beings who are innately hostile to humans.
Oh, you're so warm. Are you a demon?
Yeah. And they're gonna want to eat Stu, and it's like, and they had just gotten so used to Stu being around that they totally forgot that. It just didn't cross their mind. All like, just like the toll that their behavior is having on all these other human lives, just doesn't seem to cross their mind.
I feel that it's also important to mention that Stu doesn't really have that much of a character beyond being that, human pet, really.
Right.
Like,
Well, yeah, he's kind of the fly on the wall.
right, but he plays it so well. I absolutely love how the actor plays it
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
film. He plays it really well, but basically, like the vampires, and even Nick, like, who was, apparently, like, one of his best friends when he was before he was a vampire. Like, they'll just talk to him and still be like, oh yeah, yep. And basically, he's there for them to, like, basically he's there as like a tool, but also, a friend, but he has no character. And
Right.
that's just one of the best things about Stu, is that,
Yeah.
he's just like there. And he's a great guy.
Well, yeah, I think that's another example of how well this movie did at maximizing what they had to work with and really doing some great minimalist filmmaking.
Right.
Because I think Stu was one of the more effective characters in the movie, and like you said, there really wasn't much to him.
Right. Well, and I think that's part of what makes him so appealing to them.
Right, yeah.
Is he's like the quintessential blank canvas, basically the thing with the cell phones and stuff is kind of the perfect encapsulation of his character, because he's the mirror that they actually can see themselves in, right? Because he's such an empty kind of go along shell who will feed their ideas back to them and kind of just like help them and support them without having a personality of his own. And since they're so deeply egotistical, that's perfect. That's the perfect thing.
Oh,
He
yeah.
really does become like a mirror that they can see themselves in, and I thought that was a great little touch. Does anyone have? Is anyone getting their audio through speakers instead of their headset right now?
No.
Because I am still hearing something occasionally.
I'm also hearing your voice.
You're hearing my voice fed back?
Yeah.
Yeah. B-boy, did you make any adjustments to your mic volume or your?
No.
Can you look at the little gear and? Because your sound quality changed suddenly too.
Huh.
Around the time this started.
No, nothing has changed.
Okay.
I assume so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
So
there's no changes.
Settings are the same, huh?
Yeah.
AJ, you didn't accidentally unplug your headset or something, did you?
Nope.
Okay. It sounds okay now, so I guess we'll just have to live with it. I don't know why we get these weird audio shifts mid-podcast sometimes. It's very bizarre, but yeah. So above and beyond Stu, anything else people want to talk about? Oh, Mr.
Let's talk about Vladislav.
Okay.
That's an appropriate visual cue that I don't think the audience is going to get to see, but that chase scene that I mentioned.
Yes.
Let's talk about that early on with Vladislav that he was able to change into all these different animals, but he couldn't quite get the faces right. And there's that one moment in the chase scene where they do so many jump cuts and they showcase some of these little things that the vampires can do, and all of a sudden you just see this cat sitting there with Vladislav's face.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great moment of both
Uh,
like humor and horror. That's one of the few
oh yeah.
moments in the movie that's legitimately like hilarious and scary at the same time. Uh, and of course that,
And I was actually surprised by how good the effect looked.
yeah, yeah, I agree with you
But like in a bad way.
in a bad way.
Oh
Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Or how bad it looked in a good way.
yeah, exactly. I however you
Right.
want to
Yeah.
approach that, both of those work, I
Yeah.
suppose. And it also is another one of these great callbacks to folklore and to these. I mean, they even show the old medieval drawings of the animals with human faces and stuff, and that's something that
Yeah.
doesn't get referenced in vampire movies, probably because it's so silly. But it's just wonderful the way it plays out, and the way it's the way it's placed right in the middle of that one legitimately tense, kind of scary sequence in the movie.
Mhm.
And that really is that sequence, the way it's shot and the way it's like almost a kind of house of literal sort of house of horrors thing, where like he opens different doors and he opens one and like one of the vampires is eating that girl that was also at the dinner party, and he opens another and he sees Vlad with the cat with the Vlad is the cat with the human face, and then he like runs outside and Peter grabs him, and the whole
Which
way
was
that
a
plays out.
fantastic jump scare.
Yeah. Yeah, because Peter is the one legitimately scary-looking vampire in this movie.
Yeah, yeah. That Nosferatu callback
Right.
visual design that they did with the Peter character was just fantastic. And I'm glad that they didn't overplay the Peter character.
Yeah.
Like, I'm glad that he had such a minimal role in the
Yeah.
film. I think that really was for the best, because that would have been such a huge detriment if they had overdone
Yeah.
the Nosferatu in a mockumentary like this.
And it would have been really bad if they had decided, let's give him dialogue. The fact that they don't give
Yeah,
him any
yeah.
dialogue, and the
Except
fact
with
that,
those
Hissing.
with those teeth
Right.
in his mouth, I can only
Right.
imagine what it would have sounded like had he tried to speak.
right, and the fact that they at one point say that he's 8,000 years old, which implies that he's some kind of entirely different thing, some kind of like ancient evil or something.
Right.
It goes back to like
Yeah,
biblical
yeah.
times, and that he remains unknowable and legitimately monstrous, which is one of the great features of the Nosferatu style of vampires, and one of the
Right.
reasons Nosferatu as a movie works so much better than a lot of contemporary vampire films. The fact that they knew that and didn't shy away from that, and also didn't like feel the need to make him funny, except in the way that like all scary things are also funny.
Yeah. Well, in a way, I think he was almost one of the most effective hidden jokes in the entire film too.
Yeah.
Because you think about it, 8,000-year-old, incredibly powerful vampire. Why is he living in these three douchebags' basement?
Right, right. You wonder actually if he's not sort of senile.
Yeah.
Because why does he decide that
Like,
Nick of all fucking people would make a great vampire, And he
yeah.
doesn't
Like,
really
is this
communicate.
Grandpa in the home? Like,
Yeah, exactly. And he came with one of the other. Which one is it? Viago or Vlad? Who he?
Deacon. It was Deacon that he turned.
Oh, it's Deacon. Okay, so he
Yeah.
came with Deacon, and you get the sense that this is sort of like Deacon's grandpa, who he's just bringing around with him. He's just like, because Deacon just, when he decided to move to New Zealand, he just brought him along. Oh, and that's a joke that I forgot, that Deacon who was
Oh yeah.
both a
I was just gonna
vampire
go
and a
for this.
Nazi. And there's that great sequence where he's like, after the war, it was tough to be a Nazi and it was tough to be a vampire, but damn, it was really tough to be a vampire and a Nazi.
Just forget it. Get out of the country.
Right. And so he just took Peter along with him, and Peter, and that's interesting. The weird way where, like, at one point he's this almost senile pet, and the other on one hand, he's this almost senile sort of pet or grandfather figure or whatever that they all sort of seem to have this sort of reverence for, but clearly don't think of as being totally all there, or at least not communicative. But on the other
Well,
hand, he's also apparently this great sort of power. Like he's like the head vampire, right? And this
Right.
sort of like terrible, unknowable force.
Like
And the way
even
that
even the vampires, like even those three douchebags are like kind of scared of him.
kind of scared of him, yeah.
Even though they also like
There was such a
think of him
great
as
scene.
family or whatever.
Yeah, like that intro scene where Viago is going through the house and
Yes,
waking everybody
exactly.
up.
Yeah,
That was such a great lead in, especially when you got to Peter and you see this giant concrete box in the basement and he slides it open to throw a chicken in a bag in there.
Yeah.
And the whole time he's like, it's kind of a mess down here. What would you think if I got you a broom?
And it's like,
Maybe
oh, a
sleep on
spinal
these
column.
skeletons. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I just stepped in it. And Viago is so fussy, and that adds so much
Oh.
to some of the scenes, I thought.
Oh yeah,
This
definitely.
kind of fussy vampire living with them. The scene where he lays the newspaper out under the woman that he's getting prepared to bite.
Yes. Especially after the call out earlier where he says to I think he said it to Deacon, if you're going to eat someone on the couch, can you at least put a towel down first?
Right. And then of course punctures the main artery and she bleeds all over the place.
Yeah.
And there's that great kind of gross out laugh there, but it's made all the more better because of the character it happens to.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Because he's this fastidious, fussy kind of character. To have it happen to him is so much more funny than having it happen to Deacon or
And then the follow up of him saying, so yeah, something went wrong with that. They hit the main artery. It's a mess in there.
And then it
was just so
on him.
pitch perfect.
It lingers on him for far too long for it to be comfortable.
Oh. Yeah, that was one of those great moments.
So, any other joke scenes that you want to focus on?
How about the way that they played out this whole concept of Vladislav's great rival, the Beast?
The Beast!
They made it sound exactly what you were hoping it would be. They made it sound different from what the actual payoff for the joke was.
Right.
And they did it in such a spectacular way.
Right. In a way so in keeping.
Because when they finally... Oh, yeah, absolutely. When they finally get there, it's just so great because you think, okay, so it's the Beast. We fought the Beast on a cliff. He fought the Beast in a cave. He fought the Beast in a bathroom at a bar.
Yeah.
And then they reveal that it's his ex-girlfriend, and it's like, okay, now that last one makes sense.
Yeah, right. Right, exactly. And suddenly, a joke that was funny on one level before takes on a new meaning and becomes funny.
Yeah.
There are a few of those in there. As long as we're talking about jokes that like recurring jokes, I think my favorite recurring joke, and I didn't even really get it 100% until after the movie was over. But my favorite joke that really clicked in later was the Halloween costume joke. And the thing that I love about that joke is you're expecting it to be one joke and it's a different joke.
Yeah.
It's like the offensive Halloween costume thing, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, one time I went to the, well, it's not Halloween, it's this, Monster Mash basically. What was it? The Unholy. What was the name of the event?
The Unholy Masquerade.
Yeah, something like that sounds right. But it's basically the Monster Mash, and it's basically a Halloween costume party for people who already lived their lives in costume. But he's like, oh yeah, I decided to go as Whoopi Goldberg in Sister Act, and you're expecting, like this is a 200-year-old vampire. He's gonna go as Whoopi Goldberg, and you're expecting the blackface joke, right? Because that's every offensive Halloween costume
Oh yeah.
is some idiot went to his Halloween party in blackface,
And not
and
only
he's like,
that,
oh, it's
but
Whoopi.
blackface drag, no less.
Right, exactly. And you're like, oh, okay, I know where this is going. And then it cuts, and he's not in blackface at all. He's just wearing the nun's costume and the habit. And he's like, yeah, people got offended because vampires don't really like nuns, we don't really get along with the Catholic Church. Oh, it was an offensive, And they didn't even say in advance, like, yeah, I had an offensive Halloween costume to set up the joke. It's like, it's just playing on your natural expectations. And then that joke comes back again with Blade and Wesley Snipes, and it's like, I decided to go to the masquerade as Blade, and they're like, oh, that's not really appropriate. And of course, we think, well, because you can't do blackface, but he's not in blackface at all. It's just because he's a vampire hunter, and that's offensive. Vampire, and I love that joke. I mean, it's just so.
Especially his defense of it. His defense of it is, well, vampires hate vampire hunters. What's wrong with you? But we love Wesley Snipes.
We love Wesley Snipes. Who doesn't love Wesley Snipes?
It was just such a deadpan, perfect moment right there.
Right. And the blackface thing is never mentioned overtly, but it's always hanging over those scenes, and I love the way they executed that.
Oh yeah.
Other
the werewolf scenes.
Yes, let's talk about the werewolf scenes.
For me, those were very, very entertaining moments. We're a werewolf pack, not a swearwolf pack.
We're werewolves, not swearwolves.
That was very funny.
Yeah.
It's like that Captain America language moment.
Yeah.
Stop swearing so much. Why are you always swearing? Then and we don't sniff our own crotches. We sniff each other's crotches, and it's a greeting. Why are you telling them this? Why is that camera pointed at us? There were some pretty good moments with that.
And that, of course, leads up to the inevitable camera joke that we've been waiting for the whole movie, where one of the cameramen is actually murdered, not by a vampire, but by a werewolf. And that was a great kind of gag. But the thing I love about there are a couple of things I loved about the werewolves. One is that the werewolves not werewolves thing is like superficially silly and funny, but it also makes sense on some level, because their whole thing is all the time they're trying to control their impulses, because they're trying to chain them. They're worried they're going to chain, so they need to chain themselves to trees, and so the werewolves not werewolves thing is like the Hulk, like, don't make me angry, right? I mean, it's this really hilarious take on it. But the whole time, everything they do is structured around trying to control their impulses, trying to maintain some kind of power over themselves, because once they transform, all of that is lost. And I thought that was another one of these instances where it doesn't lose sight of, like, the quote-unquote reality of these monsters, and their motivation, and the tension between their humanity and inhumanity. But they play it in a really just great, funny way.
Well, and I think that it was a nice touch too in that scene where they were chaining themselves up and trying to prepare for the full moon and the involuntary change, that the guy who was telling the other werewolf to stop cursing so much was the one that was cursing.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that was a nice touch.
Well,
especially, like you said, to play up that aspect of self-control and of monitoring what you're doing and saying. I think that was it was an intelligent callback.
Yeah, and the whole alpha thing, the way that plays out near the end of the film is fantastic.
Yeah.
And it gets into this sort of, the wonderful thing about this movie is that all of these characters are fucking losers. Instead of the fact that they're like immensely
yeah.
powerful,
Oh, yeah.
supernatural beings, they are losers to the nth degree. And one of the most fascinating dichotomies that exists here is the different kind of losers that the vampires are when compared to the werewolves. Like they're both absolute like sad sack pathetic losers, but the
Oh, yeah.
vampires are like the quintessential like uh outsider like losers, sort of like what's the word, like individualist losers,
Hmm.
whereas like the werewolves are the pack mentality losers. They're the loser bros, right? They're the guy, and
Yeah. Yeah.
they're the conformist losers. You're sort of the non-conformist losers and the conformist losers, and the movie doesn't lose sight of the way that both of them are just pathetic. and,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
both of that, and it's kind of great that Stu ends up with the conformist losers instead of the non-conformist losers, since the man
Yeah.
is
That
just
was
like
a good touch.
the perfect sort of wallpaper person. Like, and he even nails it at the end when it's like, "Why are you laughing?" And he's like, "Well, the group was laughing." With the,
Hmm.
it's like that's the right answer. Whereas the other werewolf was trying to rationalize it or whatever. But Stu just kind of inherently understands that, innately understands that pack mentality, that idea that, well, I'm doing this because other people are doing this, and I want to be accepted.
Right, but essentially that was basically sort of like it wasn't like a good answer, but everyone accepts it additionally because it's Stu, and Stu's a great guy.
Well, but it was a good answer. I mean, it was a bad answer from our perspective. It's a stupid answer, but it
Oh,
was
yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
the answer that the alpha male wanted to hear.
Right, right.
And that's what Stu excels at, is just being what other people want him to be.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh.
and any other jokes and things like AJ, you haven't.
Well, let's talk about Nick too. We've got to talk about Nick.
We
Yeah.
should. I mean, he's a
Kind of
major
left.
character, and he hasn't
Yeah.
really been touched upon.
I would like to say that there's one scene between Nick and Stu that I really enjoyed. Um, at the beginning, Nick is attempting to hide the fact that he's a vampire from Stu, and he's
Right.
able to additionally use his newfound powers of hypnosis in order to help him achieve that.
Right. All the hypnosis scenes are great.
The hypnosis in this is spectacular. Like one of the first introductions you get to it, I think, is Deacon performing hypnosis on Nick when Deacon's familiar Jackie brings over them as potential meals and victims, and they serve Nick up some spaghetti, and Deacon's like, Nick, why don't you eat some biscotti? And so Nick takes a bite, and then Deacon waves his hand and says, how do your worms taste, or something like that.
Right.
And it's like hilarious because like at first you're not really sure if anything's actually happening.
Right. If it's working, yeah.
Right. But then and there's another great callback to that later when Nick tries the same thing on Stu with chips, because I think because he's upset that like everyone likes Stu, and
Or French fries, as we call them in America.
yes. And Deacon points out to Nick that it doesn't work on chips.
It only works on things that look like worms already.
Like worms. Which is great. But Nick sits down with Stu to tell him that he's a vampire.
Right. The coming out scene.
And it's played out like a reality TV show so well. And that's absolutely hilarious because, like, Nick mentions, like, I'm sure that you've noticed a few things changing about me.
Right.
And he mentions, like, And usually you win all our tennis games, and I've won the last 3.
And we used to play tennis during the day. Now have you wondered why we always have to play at night now? And the great thing about that is Stu's responses, where it's just like it would be exactly the responses you would expect if you were breaking some kind of unexpected news to someone, like if you were coming out, or if you were saying, "Oh yeah, I have cancer," or if you were whatever, it doesn't matter. It was one of those like revelation scenes.
One of those really serious
Right.
scenes where they're mentioning things that are completely like, someone's like, "Oh yeah, that does actually make sense."
Right. And Stu is just like, yeah, like it's very like sort of sad, like, yeah, I've been thinking about it. Yeah, not at no point is he like, yeah, it's kind of fucking obvious or anything. He's just like very subdued and accepting of the whole thing.
And there's no humor at all. It's very
Right. Well, there are no jokes,
right.
but it's funny. It's very, Yeah, that was a great scene. Anything else you want to touch on in the movie?
We should talk about Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie's kind of the whole familiar relationship is kind of an interesting one. Did you have something you wanted to say about that?
I think I like the fact that they built up Jackie before returning to Peter, because that kind of, it was sort of a build up to a better payoff, because you see Jackie and the character is introduced to you and you don't feel that much sympathy for her. Like, you feel bad, but also she's kind of annoying. Did anyone else get that?
I mean, I think that I don't know. I mean, she's very pragmatic about the way she goes about this, right?
Yeah.
She wants to become a vampire. She's going to do the work she has to do. She's given an assignment. She's going to fulfill it.
Right, but she like doesn't. She plays it very like, she doesn't look past anything that's going on. There's a lack of like awareness as to what's happening. Of Deacon's basically like pushing it off, and but he's an immortal being of like, who kills people, so she's kind of protecting herself there.
Yeah, well, I don't know to what degree she's protecting herself. I think it's I think it's a couple of things going on. I mean, on one hand, who wouldn't want eternal life, right? And she's really whole hog into the idea of becoming a vampire, and really sold on the idea that she's going to get eternal life out of this bargain. And hell, if someone says, "Oh, you can have eternal life," I'd probably bring them victims too. But she's obviously like irritated. She's very much like I get a very like middle management vibe from her. Kind of, I'm gonna do what I have to do to get promoted, boss. But also, like, once the boss isn't there, she's like the fucking asshole.
Right.
So it's very transactional for her. You don't get the sense, like, a lot of times the servants of vampires in horror films, or even if you think of like Dr. Frankenstein's Iago, it's like they're just like fiercely loyal to their boss, and they're doing it
with Nosferatu.
Yeah, exactly. They're doing it out of this sense of just blind devotion. So to have her not be operating out of that framework at all, but to be just totally like utilitarian about it, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get what I want to get, is great.
Well, and I liked the part where she was explaining her approach too, where she's like, "Well, I have to know these people, but I can't be too attached to them."
Yeah.
Like sending her ex-boyfriend from when she was 12, who was of course Nick, and he winds up getting, turned, sending him in to get eaten. It's like, okay, that's both really practical and really petty at the same time.
Petty is exactly the word. And
Very
the woman
petty.
who
The
coined
woman.
some pet name for her that she hated in college.
Yeah.
He sat next
it's-
to her in class in one semester.
Yeah. It's just that kind of. It's all like she. That's the word. That is exactly the word for her. Is petty. She's like just completely petty.
Yep.
And at the end, where Nick finally ends up turning her after he gets banished from the flat.
Yeah.
And she's a vampire, and then there's a scene at the end where she's like talking to her husband. She's like, "And my husband is now my familiar," and she's like, "I love you. I love you, but I am your master."
Yeah. The roles have changed.
Really great, because that's
I think she says there's been a shift in power dynamics.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
She's finally gotten the promotion, and now she gets to boss around, the people who used to be equals / above her.
Right. Rather than just turning her husband, which is what if she was really if it was really just a loving relationship and she just wanted her husband to live forever like her, she would have done that right away. But it's like, nah, I'm gonna make I had to play this game. I'm gonna make him play it too.
Right.
Yeah.
And some part of her might be letting him get older while she stays younger.
Yeah.
Even that ego.
Yeah. I enjoyed the scene where Nick just starts going through the town and going through all these bars and party scenes and all these other places, just announcing, "I'm a vampire."
Like Twilight. Like Twilight. That's what he says.
I thought that was one of those moments where it shows that this is not the most intelligent guy in the world turned into a vampire. But at the same time, I thought that was actually a very realistic moment, because there are a lot of idiots out there that just go around announcing everything to anybody. That's the Facebook generation. That's I'm going to take a picture of every single meal that I eat and put it on the internet generation.
Right.
That's what would happen these days if someone were to just get turned into a vampire when they were still out there living that frat boy lifestyle. They would just go out there and just announce it like, "Woo, look at me, I drink blood."
Yeah, absolutely.
And then they showcase, of course, how badly that can fuck things up.
I love how the guy, the vampire hunter, is like, "Oh, that's great, I'm a vampire hunter." It's kind of interesting because the fact that he says that at all, he's also kind of a moron. To be like, "Oh, I'm a vampire hunter." Isn't that
And the funny thing is, they actually played that scene very well, because, like Nick said, I thought he was joking.
Yeah.
And I kind of brushed off I thought he was joking too, because let's be honest, vampires are real, but most people don't know it. Someone walks up to you and says, "I'm a vampire."
Yeah,
there's going to be someone that's going to have that sarcastic comeback of, "Really? I'm a vampire hunter."
Right. Yeah, I'm Blade, motherfucker. Sure.
Yeah. That's a logical joke, and the fact that there was actually a payoff to it, I really, really appreciated that.
Right.
And how Nick responds to it is great. He basically is like, "Yeah, buddy, sure."
Right.
And he gave him his email address.
He gave him his email.
Right.
Like that. That was one of those ridiculous lines. Like, you gave him how and why?
Seems like a cool guy, right?
Yeah.
An impressive beard.
I mean, that kind of you've all felt that at one point or another. There's someone online who says something outrageous, and you're like, "Hey, fucking add him as a friend,"
Right.
Oh yeah.
And also the casting of that guy, even though he's only in the film like for one scene alive and one scene dead, is pitch
Yeah.
perfect because he simultaneously looks like both the kind of hipster you would meet in the bar who would make a snide joke about being a vampire hunter and an actual vampire hunter.
Yes. Yeah.
Between like the beard and the just everything about him, his build and the way the line delivery and it all it's so perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
I really appreciated the way that they cast the movie. I think that they chose a lot of great actors for the roles
right, even the
that
smaller
they
roles,
had.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think especially the smaller roles in a lot of ways, because those smaller roles are really what brought the movie to life. Because if it was just those same three guys for an hour and a half,
Yeah.
I don't know if I could have done them watching the movie all the way through in one sitting.
Yeah.
But those little smaller roles really were what kind of broke that up and actually made the movie work.
Yeah. And certainly giving the main characters other characters to play off of. So we're pretty deep in. We're well past an hour here. So we
yeah.
should probably think about wrapping up. And I want to talk. Usually at the end of the podcast, we talk about the end of the movie, and I do want to talk about the end of the movie because I'm ambivalent about the way the movie ended. But before we do that, anything else you guys want to mention or talk about, or no?
Not that's coming to mind.
Okay, so let's move on to the ending. How did you guys feel about the ending of this film? Because this is probably the first movie, even though it's a vampire movie. Even though it's a movie about a bunch of creatures that kill humans to survive. This is, I think, probably the first movie we've ever done on the podcast to have an unequivocally happy ending, like a really like joyously happy ending where everything works out for every character. And it has a kind of fake out sad ending before the happy ending, which is interesting.
Yes.
I really liked the ending. I really liked it as a happy ending. I think it just went thematically with the movie very well. I also think that it it was much better. I think it was a lot better. Like it said something about Stu better than just Stu dying. And like that the scene where the vampires get to Stu and Vladislav is, I think it was Vladislav on the hill trying to comfort Nick.
I think it was Deacon actually.
Oh, Deacon, yeah. But Deacon comforting Nick and going through mourning. If it had left off there, I don't think it just wouldn't have fit with the rest of the movie really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would have been too much of a downer.
Right, and there's also like it's funnier that everything worked out perfectly in the end, like not just because it ended on like a happy note, but just that the vampires and the werewolves got together, and the werewolves come into the vampires' flat, and they're making
there's a reconciliation there of the age-old rivalry of vampire versus werewolf, right?
Right.
And once again, of course, it's Stu who facilitates it.
Well, yeah, because he's a great guy.
He's a great guy.
B-Boy, did you want to say anything about the ending?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on being ambivalent about it, but at the same time, as happy as the ending was, it kind of goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, where, like you said, these guys are all absolute pathetic losers. So for them, the happy ending is the status quo remains intact, and now there are more of them. Like that's
Yeah,
the
they have more
happy
friends now.
That's the
Yeah.
happy ending. There are now more pathetic waste of space losers in their friends group.
Yeah. I mean, I know
Like
that's what I strive for,
well, yeah, I know.
but I don't know. I'm ambivalent because on some level, this having both endings feels like a real kind of have your cake and eat it too sort of thing,
Yeah.
where they got to do the sad ending, complete with Deacon's little monologue there about like the costs of being a vampire. You know, the emotional toll of having to watch your friends die, having to basically watch everyone around you die, and how immortality kind of sucks. And they get the sad payoff to the Stu storyline, which is like, oh yeah, you know, being around all these monsters is pretty dangerous for a human being. Um, but then they also get to give every character that you care about a happy ending. So everyone gets to leave the theater feeling good, and they get to like pay the thematic question of the film off, or the sort of thematic ideas of the film off through the sad ending, but then they get the happy ending in there, so nobody actually leaves the theater disappointed. Uh, and I generally speaking, I really hate that.
Mhm.
In other movies, I would think that would be, especially in a dramatic film that tries to pull that shit, where okay, let's give the sad ending so that this seems like a serious movie, and then let's give the happy ending so that nobody gets pissed off and gives it, you know, we don't get any bad. It's like we get the sad end. We had the sad ending for the critics, and then we have the happy ending for the audience, right?
Right.
And I think that's generally really insincere and fucking dumb. But I'm much warmer to that ending in this film than I would normally be. But I feel like it did that a little bit with Viago's storyline too, where you got like on the one hand you got the sad ending with him and the woman he's been pining after for all this time, where he's like watching her from afar, and he has to deal with the fact that she's now 90 years old and it's only a matter of time before she dies, and where he's like dealing with that mortality, but he then like, oh well, I'll just make her a vampire and now we're together, and then there's the cradle robbing joke, of course, where like he's the one robbing the cradle even though he looks like he's 35 and she looks like she's 96.
I enjoyed that one. I enjoyed that little scene.
And you get the kind of sweet, like you get the bittersweet ending, and then you get the like happy ending. It's like, oh hey, we got but I think it works in this movie on one level because it's a comedy.
Right.
And there's something almost, I think to say Shakespearean would be too much, but there's something almost like very traditional about a comedy ending that way, about that ending that somehow miraculously manages to find a happy ending for every character. And I think all of the happy endings it found for the characters were really, really very appropriate. And made sense given like the reality they're existing in. Like, of course, if Stu gets mauled by, and in fact, I kind of saw the Stu thing coming. I'm like, oh, he got mauled by werewolves. Well, he's going to turn into a werewolf, that makes sense. And of course, he had an easy answer to the problem of like having to watch his old girlfriend waste away and die. He's a vampire. Just make her a vampire. It makes sense within the like rules of the universe. And it also pays off every character pretty well. Like Vlad gets together with his ex again, and like, how long is that gonna last? And there's this in comedy, traditionally speaking, there's this idea that there's an equilibrium in place at the beginning of the movie, or in the beginning of the play if it's a play. In the beginning of the plot, there's an equilibrium in place. Something happens that distorts that equilibrium, and then at the end of the movie, the equilibrium is reestablished. And this is that to a T. At the beginning of the movie, the equilibrium is reestablished, and the characters have grown in some ways. So in the beginning of the movie, there's a real equilibrium in the place, and that like literally Deacon hasn't done the dishes for 5 years. So that's the rut they're in, you know? There's this really firmly established routine that has been going on for so long that 5 years seems like kind of a long time to not have done the dishes. But not like, not like an obscenely long time. And then something happens. Nick is transformed into a vampire, and that fucks everything up for everyone. And Stu is introduced, and everything's thrown out of equilibrium. And then by the end of the movie, boom, they found a new equilibrium, and everyone's fit back into it, and everyone can live in it. Life goes on, and life finds a way to perpetuate itself. Even though in this case it's undeath that finds a way to perpetuate itself, or unlife. So I thought it worked. I think maybe I'm willing to give the movie a pass on some level because I liked it so much otherwise, and I feel like it kind of earned its happy ending, and also because it just the audacity of giving these people who live on human life, who live on human death, who live feeding on human blood, and who we've watched kind of callously murder a bunch of people, giving them an unequivocally happy ending, I think, is audacious and kind of
Oh, definitely.
in a way, a subversion of what you'd expect.
Oh yeah, the happy ending is that these creatures can continue killing.
Yeah, exactly. And Stu, who we kind of liked, he's a werewolf now, so he can kill people too, and you don't have to worry about his safety anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, and this one group of inhuman killing machines is now buddy with the other group, and it's like humans are totally like on the outside. Like the human life has like, who cares? Like even like a character, like all of your human points of entry in this movie are monsters by the end of it. Like Jackie's a vampire, Stu's a werewolf, and Nick is a vampire. So there are no human characters left in the film to even try to care about.
Yeah.
Which I think is pretty great. So any other thoughts on the ending of the film? No, I think we're done. Guys.
Yeah, I think we're good.
I think we can.
We've been doing this for a while. Let's just fuck it. Call it a day,
Fuck it.
Fuck it. All right. Okay.
Fuck it.